All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us tonight. This is our annual spring nutrition webinar, which is always super interesting for all of us, no matter how long we've had horses, whether this is our first thoroughbred or our 21st thoroughbred. So I'm really excited to introduce our panelists tonight. We'll start with Dr. Kathleen Crandall, who's a familiar face if you guys have been with our nutrition webinars every spring. Dr. Crandall received an MS in equine nutrition and exercise physiology from Virginia Tech under the direction of Dr. Tom Meacham, and a PhD equine nutrition and reproduction under the direction of Dr. David Kronfeld. Her MS research focused on the effects of added dietary fat in exercising growing horses, and PhD work was in vitamin A depletion and supplementation in broodmares and growing horses. Dr. Crandall spent 2 years on the faculty of Virginia Tech as the superintendent of the Middleburg Agricultural Research and Extension Center in Middleburg, Virginia. Before pursuing her degrees, Dr. Crandall spent 7 years abroad and is multilingual, so maybe she will give us an example tonight. Dr. Crandall is one of the Kentucky Equine Research technical staff and provides support for feed manufacturing partners and their customers through formulation, product development, and technical field service. Joining us for the first time this year is Dr. Katie Young. Dr. Young received her Bachelor of Science degree from Missouri State University in biology, minoring in animal science and chemistry, and earned her PhD degree from Texas A&M University in equine nutrition and exercise physiology. Her graduate research focused on mineral balance in resting and exercising horses and the effects of fat-added diets on sweat production in working horses. Dr. Young was a member of the Texas A&M Equine Science faculty for several years during and following her tenure as a graduate student. Since leaving academia, Dr. Young has spent 25 years in the feed industry as an equine nutritionist, horse feed program manager, and business consultant for a large regional feed company, and then as a technical equine nutritionist for a large national feed company in the US. She has extensive experience in horse feed formulation, quality control and production, customer service and communication, sales and sales training, marketing and regulatory and labeling requirements for equine feed. She was highly involved in every aspect of product development and launches, from ideation to formulation and production, to package design and marketing, sales training, and distribution. Dr. Young has been a professional trainer and riding instructor for more than 40 years and continues to do so in the Kansas City area. She specializes in eventing and hunter jumpers. So an all-star cast tonight. Certainly you ladies have plenty of experience to share with us. So I'm really looking forward to what you have to share. Take it away.
Oh, thank you, Kristen. So we thought that Kristen gave us this topic, the body condition scoring. And I think it's because she felt it was really something important to you as you start to work with these off-track thoroughbreds. So body condition scoring, it's a system that helps us put a number on the the condition that the horse's body is in. And the reason it's important is because it really is a measure. I mean, if they're in the right body condition, they have a much better chance of succeeding in whatever sport they're trying to do. So this body condition scoring, it's really just a subjective measure of body fat. And that fat, believe it or not, can actually influence performance. So if a horse is carrying too much fat, this causing a lot of stress on their joints. It affects their ability to cool. So it's detrimental also. If a horse doesn't have enough weight, and then usually they won't have enough
Kathleen, I think your freeze is Kristen, can you hear Kathleen?
Yeah, she is breaking up a little. Kathleen, try turning off your camera. We'll see if that does help. We might be able to hear you well. We just can't hear you and see you at the same time.
Let's see.
Well, in any case, I think she just turned it over to me. Hopefully she can still hear us, so she'll be able to change the slides. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the body condition scoring system, because it actually was developed at Texas A&M University, which is where I received my graduate degree. And it was conducted by one of the grad students who was basically a generation before me at Texas A&M, So many of the people that I worked with were involved with the body condition scoring system. So it's a little bit near and dear to my heart. And personally, I find the history of how the system was developed really very interesting. So everybody knows it as the Henneke body condition scoring system, because Don Henneke, who has since earned his PhD and worked in academia for a long time until he very unfortunately passed away from cancer several years ago. But Don put together the body condition scoring system, and he really did a lot of the building in 1979. You'll hear the citation from 1983, because that's the most published and the most cited journal article that really went into and described the body condition scoring system. He initially actually developed the system as a tool to evaluate the influence of body condition on reproductive performance. And he was looking at reproductive performance in mares to compare how well mares would carry a pregnancy and how quickly and how consistently thin versus fat mares would be rebred after foaling. So that was the project. But in order to conduct that project, he needed a system to evaluate the mares so that you could actually look and objectively give them a number that represented how much body fat they had. So the thought, Henneke and the other folks that were working on this, their thought was to develop this system to allow an on-the-ranch comparison of mares for the amount of stored fat in their bodies. And it was inspired at the time. There was a body condition scoring system in cattle that was basically referenced back to Wiltbank in 1962. So cattle have had a body condition scoring system for quite some time. And it's interesting, if you look at the places you evaluate the fat on horses compared to the cattle system, it's very similar. And even the terminology is similar in the description of the areas to evaluate. So Kathleen, if you want to go to the next slide. There we go. So again, Don was looking at whether the brood mares were more reproductively efficient when they're thin versus fleshy or fat. And at that time, what really stimulated this project was the thoroughbred breeders in Kentucky. So for those of you with off-track thoroughbreds, your folks were the ones who really got this, this project started. The common thought at that time, and remember this was back in the 70s, at that time, breeders felt that fat mares were infertile and thin mares were fertile. So they tended to keep the brood mares thin. Now, in reality, they probably weren't looking at things such as, they were usually looking at rebreeding. So if you're rebreeding and you've got a thoroughbred mare with a foal on her side, then she's probably going to be thin, because sometimes those babies really drink a lot. So they were looking at it as the thin mares had foals by the side, so they were more fertile. The fat mares were probably open, so they thought they were infertile. They'd already figured out in cattle that was not the case. So Henneke and Jack Kreider and Gary Potter, those Kreider and Potter were the two on the graduate committee, but they all kind of put together this project to look at fat versus thin, and they used quarter horse mares because this was in Texas. So that's what you've got, a lot of quarter horse mares. But in order to look at that, there needed to be a system to objectively measure and compare the fat level in those mares. Okay, so next slide.
That's crazy to me that, like, I guess that science is, obviously proven wrong.
That's how science works. That's why I think things like the history of this is just so interesting.
Right.
Okay, so when they started, Don put together a group of several expert horse producers around the Bryan College Station area in Texas. That's where Texas A&M is. They used about 70 horses, and this group of folks went through, and as I said, they kind of started with the cattle system and then changed it around, massaged it to fit horses. Because, for instance, in cattle, one of the places they look is basically the pectoral area of the cow. And you're not going to look at that on a mare. They, of course, on a cow, they don't look at the crest of the neck because they don't really have a whole lot of crest of the neck, and that's not where they store fat. So they massaged it to fit horses, and they kind of figured it out with these first 70, but then to really start to test the system and to really start the project, they took 32 quarter horse mares. And for these mares, they used the body condition scoring system, but they also ultrasounded rump fat thickness. So they actually measured the amount of rump fat to make sure it correlated with the body condition score. And they looked at the relationship between then the condition score and the body fat content of the mares during gestation and lactation. And of course, they took that on and to look at a whole lot of other measures of reproductive efficiency in those mares. But that was the beginning. And that first project was presented at the Equine Nutrition and Physiology Society conference in 1981, which ENPS is now Equine Science Society. But so you hear it referenced back to the 1983 publication, but it actually, the first actual publication, I believe, was in the proceedings from that ESS or ENPS of 1981. Okay, another slide. So then once he did that first project that presented at ESS, they wanted to take it on and really, test the body condition scoring system on all sorts of different horses, much more than the 32 original mares. So Henneke and co-workers, and a lot of this information came from Dr. Mike Clem, who took all the pictures of all the mares. And so Mike and Don and other folks went all over Texas, and they looked at 927 quarter horse mares. And again, we're looking just to make sure that the body condition scoring system was appropriate for racing quarter horses, halter horses, arena performance horses. They looked at 52 maiden mares, 378 open mares, 497 foaling mares. So a lot of horses to verify that this did work. And just from the study, the results revealed no significant influence of mare status, age of mare, or farm influence. So the body condition scoring system worked throughout on all these different mares. Now you might say, well, gosh, they only looked at quarter horses. Well, in the years since then, we've used the body condition scoring system for many, many other breeds of horses and different disciplines. And so it really has, we'll talk a little bit later about it. It can be used in pretty much any horse, anywhere, and it's a very good tool for evaluating the amount of fat that horse is carrying. So I think, I've got one more slide, I believe, before I'll turn it back to Kathleen. There we go. Okay, so the full study, which was huge, and most of the study is actually published in little articles, but aren't really cited for the body condition scoring. The full study is in Don Henneke's PhD dissertation. But what I find very interesting is there was this huge study, but that small body condition score piece is one of the most cited articles in equine nutrition and management. And that was published in 1983 in the Equine Veterinary Journal. And it's actually for the world scope of this body condition scoring system, it's only published as a little 2-page short communication in the Equine Vet Journal. So this is the actual citation. It's Henneke, Potter, Kreider, and then B.F. Yates, who is a very well-known horseman in Texas that was the equine extension specialist at Texas A&M for many, many years. And Gary Potter, Jack Kreider they were faculty members in the equine section of Texas A&M, and they were on Henneke's graduate committee. But so this, again, it's it's one of the most cited, if not the most cited article that is used in research everywhere in equine nutrition and management throughout the world. And so I just find that so fascinating that, I mean, that is Don Henneke's legacy to the horse world. And as I said, it's utilized throughout the world. It's used on all breeds. There are some modifications to allow for differences in fat deposition according to breed and individual differences in horses, because horses, just like people, some people carry fat in their middles and they're called apples, and some people carry fat in their bottom half and are called pears, and horses are the same way. But you can use the body condition scoring system, take that into consideration, and it's an excellent tool to help evaluate whether a horse is fat or thin or just right for whatever they are doing. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Kathleen.
Oh, thank you, Katie. That was great. Now, I just wanted to let you know that hopefully it's come up, but Equine Research on their body condition scores. So this is the one that's available, free download for anybody who's interested. So now we're going to get down to the actual body condition scoring and how to do it. What we do is fat cover in different parts of the body. In this diagram, you can see, we'll look at the fat cover in the neck, not only whether it's got a crest or not, but also you look at how the neck ties into the shoulder. Look at the cover over the withers. We look, and then this little fat deposit that you can find right behind the shoulder. So in an average thoroughbred, it would be somewhere between 40 and 50 pounds of body weight difference in each body condition score. So if you're trying to increase the body condition score of a horse from a 6 to a 7 or from a 5 to a 6, it'd probably be around 50 pounds of body weight. We look at these horses pretty much in 3 sections. So you look at the amount of body condition on the neck, and then you would look at the barrel, and then you would look at the hip. And you mentally, you're considering these a little bit. You're considering them separately, and then putting it all together. You will look at the horse from a distance, you look at the horse from close, and then you're going to put your hands on the horse. You could also looking at the way the horse has put the fat down on the body, so it can be smooth and very even looking, or as they get fatter and fatter and up to your highest scores, you'll see it gets lumpy.
Kathleen, I just want to point out on this diagram, well, it's gone now, but if you looked at the diagram, it kind of referenced back to the old cattle body condition scoring system, because you notice on the hip, it's called the hooks, and then back the point of the buttocks is called the pins. And those are terms we use in cattle pretty regularly. In horses, we don't so much. But it's, and in comparing the descriptions of the horse condition scoring versus cattle, in cattle, it talks about looking at the hooks and pins. And in the horse system, it says almost the same words, except instead of hooks and pins, is tuber coxae and tuber ischiae, which are those are the actual bones and joints there. So I wanted to point that out in case somebody looked and said, hooks and pins. That's interesting terminology.
Thanks, Katie. So what's really important is for you to put your hands on these horses so you can actually feel the texture of the fat, and you can feel like particularly over the ribs, if you can't see them anymore, you want to know how far you have to press in to be able to feel those ribs. And the tail head, you want to be able to put your hands on that tail head and feel how spongy it is. So that's a very important part of body condition scoring. So just a little bit about the fat cover over the back, okay? So what it is the vertebrae runs along the top line, and the most prominent part sticking up, that would be your spinous process. And then the transverse processes come out here to the side on both sides of the spinous process. So when if you look down the, oops, go back up, look down the back of the horse, the muscling would be here within those vertebrae, kind of running down this area here and here. And then there'll be a layer of fat over top. And so the skinnier the horse is, the less fat there will be there. So that means that the fat layer would only be coming over like this. So you will actually see that spinous process in a really thin horse. And then also really thin over the transverse processes, you'll actually see them on a really thin horse. So then as the horse gets fatter and fatter, and more layers of subcutaneous fat get laid down. And at a certain point, body conditioned horse 6 and above, you may have a gunnel there running down the middle of the spine. So that's what it looks just like that.
So just to go back real quick to your point about, you know, doing body condition score by feel as well as by look, that's something, you know, that's one of the reasons we do this webinar in the spring, is because it, you know, you have a good opportunity now to assess your horses coming out of winter. You know, they might not be very fit yet, but you also have plenty of time to make changes to your feed program, especially if you're looking specifically towards the makeover. So you've got time to make those changes before October. And sometimes we have, you know, trainers will post a photo and say, can you please look at this horse and score it for me in the trainer group? And we try to encourage people not to do that, just because it is really, really hard to assess this on a photo only.
Yeah.
Especially, you know, photos taken from different angles, you can make a horse look thinner or fatter depending on the way you take the picture. So this is definitely something, you know, and that's, you know, another reason we have the vet letter as part of the application process. Get your vet on board, because your vet can come out and put the hands on the horse and explain to you how they get to the score that they're at. So something to keep in mind for everybody who's not sure where their horse might fall right now is, if you're not sure and you're not confident in taking these measurements yourself, you know, get your vet on board to come out and put the hands on the horse and assess.
Yes, and that's a very good point. And I think we had intended to have an illustration in this that showed how if you took the picture of the horse from the same angle, that it would look differently. And I went out and took pictures of my horse, one of my horses, and they look so scraggly right now because they're right in the middle. Didn't end up with that slide for you, but it was our intention.
It's a tough time of year, it's fine.
Yeah. So as you're condition scoring, you're going to assign each of those sections, the neck, the barrel, and the hip, a score kind of in your head, and then look at the horse as a whole. And then you would just give a representative score of the whole, because the way horses are, they aren't always the same. You might have a horse that has a neck it's really thin, so it's a 4, and then his barrel, you don't see his ribs, so he's a 5 there. And then the hip, he's got a lot of fat over the tailhead, so he's a 6. So yeah, so he's a little mix of everything. So then it kind of averages out in your head, and the overall look at a 5. So that's sort of how we do this. Now, there are always things that you have to keep into consideration, the breed of the horse, and then the age of the horse, because they'll put the fat follows gravity, and so they tend to lose the fat up high and collect it down low. So that's something to keep in mind. And then, of course, the conformation of the horse. So going one to 9 is what we're going to do. Standing skeletons. They're extremely emaciated. That spinous process that I showed in the picture is, you can count the vertebrae. It's very prominent. And so the ribs are prominent, tailhead, bony protrusions, pelvic girdle, all are prominent. So in this picture, you can see there's no fatty tissue whatsoever on this horse. You can even see, you can almost count the vertebrae of his neck here. And everything is sticking out, those tuber ischiae and those, I mean, the tuber coxae and the tuber ischiae, everything is protruding. Looking at this one from different angles, you can see, you see like here, you see the backbone, the vertebrae are very obvious. You can see those tuber coxae and then the tuber ischiae. And you can see there's no fat over the tail head. The thing is, they may be skinny like this, but they can reform. And this pony, 1 year later, after being rescued from an abusive situation. So our next body condition score, number 2, this is very thin. These animals are still emaciated. But there's a slight bit of fat covering. It's starting to cover the base of the spine. And over the transverse processes, there's a little bit rounded. The ribs and the tuber coxae and the tuber ischiae are still very prominent. The withers, the shoulders, neck structure, they're all still discernible. So for these horses, you can see they're getting, you still see the backbone, ribs are still pretty prominent, but it's starting to look a little more round, a little bit rounder, but not really round by any means. Horses that are scored below a 3 are actually pretty rare. And there's something wrong. I mean, either the horses had really poor quality nutrition or outright neglect and abuse, or even with certain disease states, the horses can lose body condition. It's when the disease is causing their metabolism to go into high gear. And so if they lose more than 30% of their body weight, that's considered a 1 or a 2. And these horses they can be reformed with a careful feeding regime. They need high quality forage. They need the essential amino acids and quality protein, a balanced diet, and then proper hydration. So this was, one of my students sent these pictures in. The horse was rescued. She has it as a 1. I would probably call that horse a 2. Then, and then the horse came around, had looked beautiful, beautiful body condition, score 5. And then without them really realizing what happened, the horse just kept getting fatter and fatter. And before they knew it, it was up there at an 8 or 9. So, you know, they can recover body fat, but you just still need to be careful. So our body condition score 3, it's also called thin. Now fat is starting to build up about halfway on up the spinous processes, and you can't see those transverse processes anymore or feel them. You're getting a little bit of fat cover over those ribs. The tuber coxae and the tuber ischiae are starting to look a bit more rounded, a little bit less discernible, not as distinguishable. But the withers still can be pretty prominent, and the shoulders are pretty obvious here where the neck ties into the shoulder, and there's no fat on that neck. So this was a 23-year-old mare, like talking about conformation and age. Like her backbone alone, you might have thought that she was an even lower body condition score, but when you started to actually put your hand on her and feel around, you could see she had a little more fat cover, but maybe a little bit of fat coming on that tail head, but still quite hollow under the withers and prominent, and the ribs are still really easily felt. Just a couple more horses, body condition score 3. So in this slide, this horse, they gave this horse a 3+, which would be the same thing as a 3.5. Again, the prominent spine, the visible ribs. and the hollow under the withers. But there's some smooth, there's some fat being deposited down on the, in the lower abdomen. There's still prominent withers. There's no fat pad here, and you can feel those ribs very easily. The hip bones are a little more rounded, but they're still discernible. And the tail head is there, but you can't actually count the vertebrae. As the thinner they get, the more vertebrae you can count. So this horse, but even though being low in body condition, she still had a shiny coat and a bright eye. So body condition score 4 is considered moderately thin. We still have a negative crease, which means that instead of that gully, the gully going down the back, it's still, the vertebrae is still, and the spinous process is still more obvious. And you'll see a faint outline of the ribs. The tail head is still visible, but you're starting to be able to feel a little bit of fat coming in around there. Those hip bones are a lot smoother looking and rounder looking. And the withers, at least in this horse, it's not a horse with a very prominent wither, but you can start to see some fat being deposited here on either side of the withers. And then that neck is not as pencil thin as some of these really thin horses can have. Now, again, this one, when I said that sometimes the horses have a mix of different body condition scores, I would probably score this neck at a 3 on this horse, but those ribs and the amount of fat over the back, and then the hip is more like a 4. So the optimal body condition is for performance horses is more like from 4.5 to 6.5. It kind of depends on the sport, what they expect. In the English disciplines, dressage, they like a little more body cover, a little more fat, and they like the horses to look a little more rounded. Eventing, again, to get that horse around 5, no more than a 6, so that the horse isn't carrying too much weight, but has enough of the body stores to get all the way through the event. Show jumping, again, it's almost, they need those body stores, but it's also a look that they're looking for a nicely smooth looking horse. And endurance, it is definitely a factor of the horse needing enough body stores to be able to finish that ride. For the event horses, if these elite horses don't have enough body fat, it can be disastrous because they just run out of gas halfway through the course, or when they're coming to a jump and then they don't have quite the energy to get over it, and it can be pretty scary. So just another body condition score. Now this is an Arabian, not a thoroughbred, but about a 4.5. You can't see the ribs not so well in this photo, but you could see the ribs on that horse. So body condition score 5, considered moderate. The back is starting to be level, so you don't have that prominent spinous process. I mean, it's now almost like a table. And the ribs, for most of us, that's like the first thing we see when we look at a horse body condition score. Can you see the ribs or can you not? Oh, you can't see the ribs? Okay, it's at least a 5. So that's a start. One of the more prominent things, I guess, when you're looking for body condition scores is the amount of fat over those ribs. The tail head, now we're starting to, it's not prominent, it's level, it's starting to get a little bit of that spongy fat around the tail head. The withers are becoming more rounded. This junction between the neck and the shoulder becomes smoother. They're not starting to carry a crest, but maybe certain breeds you might they might start to have a little bit of a cresty neck. So these are another couple examples. You see it's a very, very sleek but smooth looking fat cover over horses. So this would be your ideal body condition. another horse with just the ideal body condition. So when you're doing these, sometimes when you're doing these body condition scoring, you may look at a horse and go, oh, and then when you actually put your hands on and start to feel around, you're like, oh, well, maybe this horse is not so bad as I thought. So conformation really can affect the look of a horse, but once you get your hands on it, it can give you a whole different impression. So the other thing is the breed. There's a nice thoroughbred down here, just looking nice and balanced and smooth and beautiful. And yet you get a Clydesdale, and because it's big and it's going to have a thicker neck, and there's certain things about the horse that would make you say, oh, it's a fat horse. But if you put your hands on this horse, you would see that you could, you can't see the ribs, but you could feel them easily. It wasn't really carrying any fat over the tail head. So even though they're big, the way they're put together, it still is not as fat as you might think. And then with an old horse, like this mare, she was 28 or something like that, if I remember correctly. You could see that now her spinous process is becoming more prominent, but that had nothing to do, that is just an age-related thing. And she'd lost some muscling under there. So people thought, oh, what a skinny horse. But then when you actually put your hands on her, you could feel fat behind the withers. I mean, there's some fat here under the withers, but here, particularly behind that shoulder, there was a fat pad. And she had like a nice smooth covering over her ribs. What I was saying earlier about how gravity takes the fat on these older horses and has a pull on it. So the fat is kind of moved from up there to down in this area. So a body condition score 6, this is considered moderately fleshy. They might start to have a slight crease down that back, and the fat over the ribs is starting to feel a little bit spongy. So they're a little more pronounced, a little softer and spongier over that tail head. The withers are starting to fill in, particularly in here. They may start to get a little bit of a crest. This junction starts to get really smooth and less prominent.
Let me say something too about the crease down the back. That to some extent, that really can be affected by breed. For instance, you can have a quarter horse that is fairly thin and still has a crease down its back because that's just how they're built with the muscle along the spine. Yeah. And there are some thoroughbreds that can get really fat and are still smooth over the back. It's just, difference in breeds, differences in how they're built. And one of the things with body condition scoring is you have to take that into consideration, and you don't necessarily always average out each of those 6 places to get the final body condition score. You have to kind of weight the average. If you've got a Clydesdale, he's going to have a big crest and a big fat pad behind the shoulder, even at a body condition score 5. So you just have to take that into consideration. So it's not a just cut and dry score each area and average them. You have to think about what you're looking at and evaluate how those horses are storing fat.
Yeah, so like this mare here, you can't really see this, but she's level over the back. There's no, I gave her a 6. This, because she was a Arabian warm blood cross, she may have more prominent like hip structure than but that's her breeding. It doesn't have anything to do with the amount of fat, but she still is very rounded over her hindquarters.
I'm just going to jump in real fast. If anybody has questions as we're going, definitely type them into the chat or the Q&A. I see someone's raised their hand on Zoom, so just type that out and we'll make sure that we get that question answered.
So with these moderately fleshy horses, they're just a nicer, rounder look. So you can see the hindquarters are really nice and round looking. So they were starting to look very smooth. This, again, is the condition score. You're going to see horses, dressage horses. I think people think this horses look healthier when they carry this amount of body fat. Now, depending on the sport, they look healthy, but it may not be good for them. But for certain sports like dressage, it certainly is not a problem. Now we're going to get up to our heavier weights. So body condition score 7, this is called fleshy. These horses can have that crease down the back, particularly if it's like not a quarter horse. Like a quarter horse may have already had the crease, but some of the other breeds will start to get the crease down the back. And you can't see those ribs for sure. And you're having a little bit of trouble finding them, like feeling them. There's getting more and more fat around the tail head, and the neck starts to thicken a bit. So at this point, when the body fat is greater than 20 to 25% of their body mass, then they're considered overweight, and that would be a body condition score of 7 or above. It's considered overweight. Again, at this point, these horses are going to be carrying so much fat over the whole body that it may start to affect their ability to cool. And this, of course, is more detrimental in hotter climates and particularly more humid hot climates. Again, the pictures can be a little misleading, but this horse was certainly quite round, and you can start to see what we're talking about, that gullet in the back. I mean, it looks good on the horse, this much condition, but it's starting to get to the point where it may affect their performance. So one thing to keep in mind is not to be to really look and put your hands on the horse and feel for the fat cover, because just because they have a big extended abdomen, it does not mean that they're fat. It is usually an indication of other things, like that they're not fit, because a horse that's just been hanging out in a pasture eating whatever grass he could find may just get those muscles get loose and lax, and so they don't hold their abdomen up very well. So even skinny horses can have a hay belly. Another thing that can cause a hay belly is if they have a lot of indigestible in their fiber from poor quality hay, that can just fill up just a lot of gut fill, and that'll make them look extended in the abdomen. And older horses, they tend to get that way just because their backs are starting to sag, and so they look rounder underneath. So the fitter the horse is, the less likely they are to have a hay belly. And you can see a horse, in particularly that when you started with them, they had a whole different outline, maybe that hay belly, and then you started working them and it tightened up, and then by the time you're ready to compete, it looks like a totally different horse. There's the other thing is brood mares. They of course, as the baby's growing in there, they're going to have a bigger belly. So don't be fooled by that. Also, mares that have had several pregnancies, they just get a little bit more lax in the muscle tissue, and they don't ever seem to tighten back up again. So you have to put your hands on and look at them, look for the fat deposits before you call a horse with a belly a fat horse. So body condition score 8, this is considered fat. In our research, we consider body condition score 8 and 9 as obese. So 7 overweight, 8 obese. These horses have a crease down the back. It's difficult to find their ribs, and that fat around that tail head is soft and spongy. The area along the withers, are starting to fill up with fat. Sometimes they lose their withers. It just becomes like one continuous like roundness over the back. And you have a hard time keeping your saddle on. The neck is starting to look thicker, and then you can even start to see them putting some fat in on the inside of their thighs. A couple pictures of horses that would be given a body condition score 8, looking very, very round. Now this horse is pretty loose in the back, a little bit of a sway back, but so he probably doesn't have a gullet just because of his conformation. This one you can see it's almost like a table across that back. Another horse with a body condition score of 8, again, very round looking, very, you're starting to see with this one, I don't know if you can, that the fat is a little bit less smooth. Yeah, and some horses are just that way. They're just easy keepers, and no matter what you do whatever you can to try to keep the weight off of them, but that's just the way they are. So body condition score 9, this is considered extremely fat, definitely obese. There'll be like a whole channel for rain to catch the rain down the back on these horses. It might just start looking really patchy. Like they'll get lumpy lumps of fat over the ribs, but also on their hind quarters. They almost lose the tail head because the fat is bulging around it. And you can't hardly see the junction between the shoulder and the neck with these horses. And look at the crest on this guy. Again, that fat in the inner thigh that can be so pronounced that they might even, their thighs might even rub together. And they lose their flank. They tend to lose the flank. So, yep, lots of belly going on there. You see the neck on this guy. He's losing the definition here, even in the chest with the neck, and then that's a huge crest. So extremely fat.
Did we lose Kathleen? There we are.
There she is.
Yeah. Am I back again?
You're back.
In the metabolic disorders. Okay. So fat ponies. So there are a couple other systems that we use for evaluating, and I'm not going to go into this one. It's called the resting neck scoring system and I won't go into too much detail. It's just a way to evaluate horses for metabolic disease. Like they tend to put fat in a strange way into their neck if they have equine metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance. But it's a 1 to 5. And then the other thing is the top line. So there's another scoring system for looking just at the top line. And this one is not looking at fat. This is looking at muscling. And there's a whole, this isn't part of KER, but if you go to toplinebalance.com, you can read all about this top line evaluation system. The things that 4 elements of top line health are nutrition, saddle fit, exercise, and genetics. Again, I won't go into much detail, but what you're looking at is the top line there on the withers, the loin, and the croup. So with that, I am going to turn things over to Katie because she's going to talk about the application to body condition scoring.
Now that you've all gotten good at going out and feeling over your horse and figuring out what their body condition score is, and you've got to figure out what their body condition score is now, and then say, is that appropriate for what I'm doing with my horse? Because this horse at this was actually when it was still Rolex, is the appropriate body condition score for that horse is different than one of the Budweiser Clydesdales down there on the bottom. And as Kathleen said, with an eventer, especially a upper level eventer, you're going to be looking at a probably 5 to a 5.5. And a Budweiser Clydesdale, actually, the ideal body weight is, or I'm sorry, the ideal body condition score is at least a 6, no less than a 6. And the reason is because these horses out in the public, if you get a Clydesdale, you saw the picture of the Clydesdale that was a 5, you look at his rear end, he looks kind of skinny. So you have to figure out what you're going to do with your horse and make sure they are the appropriate body condition score. Now, what the scoring system actually does is just, it's the measure of whether your caloric needs, the calories that the horse is getting are actually being met. So the appropriate body condition score depends on the individual animal, as well as the life stage, the purpose or performance. And to me, performance means whatever the horse is doing for a living. The performance may be activity, it may be breeding, it may be growth, but you want to feed the horse to provide the calories to support whatever the horse is doing. Okay, next slide, please, Kathleen. So you make sure that you use your body condition score to determine whether your horse is the appropriate weight for the size and the frame, as well as the purpose. A lot of times we kind of get tied up with how much does my horse weigh? And as a nutritionist, I'm not even as interested in how much the horse weighs, but what the body condition score is. Okay, what do they weigh, but is that the right weight for that horse? Because that's the body condition score tells you that. Now, if your horse's body condition score is above the ideal for your horse, then you really should put them on a weight loss program, which is never any fun. But of course, if your horse's body condition score is below ideal, when you get to 4.5 and below, then you probably want to think about a weight gain program. Now, as you saw in one of the earlier slides, for a typical mature horse, one body condition score unit is approximately 40 to 50 pounds. So if you've got a horse that's a body condition score of 3, for instance, and you want to take him to a 4, you're looking at trying to put on 40 to 50 pounds. So, and I always get tickled when somebody comes to me and says, oh, my horse is thin. I need to put 150 pounds on him. And I'm looking at this horse going, yeah, no, you're not 3. We're not looking at 3 whole body condition scores. We might be looking at putting 50 pounds or 1 body condition score on them. I do also that's my old man Boo in that picture, who is now 34 years old and still working and giving lessons and jumping. So, and I keep him at a body condition score of 5 to 5.5, which I gotta say at 34 is that's takes a lot to do. But okay, so I did want to stipulate, before you make any major changes to your horse's diet and or exercise program, make sure that you check with your veterinarian, because there may be something going on medically that is, making your horse not carry adequate body fat, and or there may be something medical that is making it hard for your horse to lose weight. So before you start trying to do something drastic, make sure you cover all your bases and that it's just, calorie intake. And if it's not just calorie intake, we want to address whatever is going on to make sure that you get your horse to the right appropriate body condition and body weight in a healthy and safe way. Okay, next slide, please. So for a weight loss program, little donkey on the top, to put that guy on a weight loss program, that's one. I'm sure there's insulin dysregulation issues going on there. So you got to be really careful on how you start taking weight off the horse. But in general, there's just no magic cure. If there was a magic cure, by golly, I would be using that. but it's just the simple decrease calorie intake and possibly increase caloric expenditure. So eat less, exercise more. Same thing for a horse as for a person. However, we got to keep the horse's gut healthy. And so with horses, you always start with forage. And for a healthy diet, you do in general want to keep 1 to 1.5 pounds per 100 pounds of body weight per day in good quality forage. And that's on a dry matter basis. So that's talking for a 1,000-pound horse, at least 10 to 12 pounds a day of hay, because hay is pretty much dry matter. Pasture, fresh grass, is much higher moisture content. So you're talking probably about 3 times that much pasture. But if your horse is on pasture, that's kind of hard to measure the weight of pasture they're eating. So in that case, if you need to minimize pasture intake, as you see my little plush pony on the bottom has a grazing muzzle, and that's a very good tool. Horses, I agree, your horses don't like grazing muzzles, but they do get used to them and they figure out very quickly how to graze with the grazing muzzle. I had a little halflinger pony that I used for lessons, and he figured out how to eat hay on a round bale with the grazing muzzle. So, but for a weight loss program in general, you don't want free choice forage, because if these are easy keepers, they can probably eat enough hay or grass to maintain themselves at an above appropriate body condition score. For thoroughbreds, that's usually not the case, where we don't often have to really worry about taking a lot of weight off of a thoroughbred, but occasionally I do come across a very sedentary, easy keeper thoroughbred that we do have to watch and make sure that they don't gain too much weight. Now, we started with the forage, and forage doesn't usually have all the nutrients that a horse needs. If a horse is on hay, hay loses its vitamin A and vitamin E content fairly quickly. So you got to make sure that you have vitamins and minerals in the diet to compensate what's usually lacking in the forage. Hays and grasses often tend to be deficient or marginal in several of the minerals as well. So again, at least a good vitamin mineral supplement for horses. And I'm a big fan of the ration balancer feeds, which have concentrated protein, vitamins, and minerals. So that's a good way that you can give about 1 to 2 pounds a day of a ration balancer and get all the nutrients without a lot of additional calories that those easy keepers don't need. Okay, and on the next slide, more typically for thoroughbreds, we want to put them on a weight gain program. So we want to increase the caloric intake. And in this, we want to do it fairly gradually. You don't want to one day go out and say, I'm going to double my horse's intake to put weight on them. Just to kind of think about it a little more scientifically, if you want to put on a 0.5 pound of gain per day in body weight, which is that's about the max that I usually want to go with. Now, there are people that will go up to about 1 pound of gain a day, and that's really pushing it. You wouldn't want to go more than that. But for about 0.5 pound, you're looking at about 3,000 to 4,000 kilocalories per day increase over the maintenance feeding rate. So if you're wanting to add some weight to your horse, if you add 3,000 to 4,000 kilocalories in a combination probably of feed and forage, that should put on about a 0.5 pound per day. And that would mean in about 90 days, if you put on a 0.5 pound a day, that's 45 pounds. That's going to be about a full body condition score in about 90 days. So again, you can do this. You can add some calories with some higher quality forage, some additional forage. The very high quality grass hays or nice alfalfa, those tend to be fairly high calorie forages. And then you can also look at an appropriate feed. There are several feeds out there that have a little bit higher fat content and very digestible ingredients that will be higher calorie feeds. And then you can just make sure between your feed and forage to ensure that you've got the appropriate nutrient to calorie ratio to support your horse's needs. Now, as Kathleen mentioned a little bit earlier, if you're refeeding a malnourished horse, so you've got that horse that is like sometimes a body condition score 3, but definitely a 1 or 2, that is a process you've got to be very careful, because those horses tend to be very delicate, and you want to have an appropriate refeeding program. And your first thought is, I have this thin horse, I just want to go and throw feed at them, because it hurts to see them that thin, but you can't do that. They are just too delicate. If they've been in a starvation situation, their gut is not ready to take on, especially high quality feeds and forages. So work with your veterinarian. There are several good research programs for refeeding the malnourished horses, but they can come back. You just have to be very careful and gradual and make sure they come back in a very healthy manner. So next slide, please. There we go. So that we would be more than happy to answer questions. If you do have questions, I know a lot of times people don't want to, ask a question publicly, but still would like maybe think about all this information and ruminate on it and come up with some questions. You have an excellent resource in Kentucky Equine Research. And one of the things I really like is the KER website, which is so easy to remember because it's KER.com. And there's a lot of information, a lot of great articles. There's research articles, informational articles on the KER website. You can contact KER, and there are people available to answer questions and help with your feeding programs and products, and all over the country and all over the world. So please feel free if you've got questions. Kathleen and I would be happy to answer some now, and or contact KER. And I just thank you very much for your time and attention.
So I do have a couple of questions that were sent in that we can touch on while we wait and see if anyone has any questions they'd like answered live. We do also invite, if you're watching this video on demand after the fact, if you couldn't join us live on Wednesday night and you're watching again on Thursday or Friday, and you have questions, definitely refer back to what Dr. Young just shared, or you can also send those in to me and I can forward those on to Doctors Kathleen and Katie. So kbentley@therrp.org. or info@therrp.org. But some of the questions that we've had ahead of time, how important is it to have a hay test if you're putting together a nutrition plan for a horse?
So I'll go ahead and take that one. And I actually have a slide of a form for submitting a hay test. Whether to get your hay analyzed is really dependent on how much hay you have and how important it is to know specifics that are in that hay. So say, for example, you have a horse that is insulin resistant and you need to know the water soluble sugars and the starch that's in that hay. Then it may be a good idea to send off a test to have it analyzed. We have like a KR, we have banks of hay tests, and we have averages. And in fact, this lab here, Equi-Analytical, they have on their website a page that allows you to search a specific type of hay and see what the typical analysis is. It'll give you the whole range of all the analyses that they've done for that type of hay, all the way from the lowest for each of the different nutrients to the highest amount for each of the nutrients. So you can look at that. We use those averages a lot if we're doing a ration evaluation and we don't have an analysis for the hay. But if you do decide that it would be important for you to know what's in that hay, how much zinc, how much copper, how much calcium, or if there's a problem, this is the form. And I would recommend that you do at least the trainer or the complete. I mean, it's not cheap. And you need to have a big enough batch of hay in your barn to make it worthwhile doing. So what you would get back if you sampled the hay appropriately and took a sample from enough of the bales, you should do somewhere between 10 and 20 different bales. Just get like a core sample if you can. If you can't, then just a good handful from the interior of the bale, and chop it up.
Kathleen, you're gone again.
Send it off to Equine Analytical. Am I back yet?
You just came back.
Okay. So you would get something like this back, and I put up two here. One, this is a hay, and this is a pasture analysis. And it, as you can see, and these are really small, and I don't know how well you can read them on your computer, but the analysis will give you things like protein, and then the amount of fibers in there, and then those sugars and starches that are in the hay, and the amount of fat, and then some of the minerals like phosphorus and magnesium, and then some of the trace minerals like zinc and copper and manganese. Now, what these analyses, you have to ask specifically for something like selenium if you want to know that, and that's actually quite a large added cost to a hay analysis. And they don't do vitamins, and so if you need to know the vitamin content, again, a lot more expensive. You might have to send it off they'll have to send it off to a different lab to have it analyzed. But just briefly, I guess, that whether to get your hay analyzed or not, it's dependent upon how important it is for you to know exactly what's in that hay. Again, we can do a diet evaluation with an average. If you told me you had moderate quality orchard grass, I have some averages, and it'll give you an approximate of what the nutrients will be in the diet of the horse. I don't know. Does that answer the question? Sorry.
I just wanted to say, a lot of times I tend to tell people, I personally, when I'm doing ration evaluations or consults, I don't usually look for a forage evaluation unless there's an issue going on. If you've got a problem and you're looking at everything and it may be a nutritional problem, then absolutely having the forage analysis can be very helpful. I had one that they were having young growing horses with a lot of DODs, and we couldn't figure out why. And of course, the first thing everybody goes to is the feed. What'd you do? You changed the formula of the feed. What's wrong? But in reality, we tested the hay, we tested the grass, we tested the water, we tested everything. And they had hay that was ridiculously low in phosphorus. And so we adjusted the ration so that it was getting adequate phosphorus, and it took care of the problem. But that's one of the issues. If you have a problem going on, then by all means, a hay analysis or a forage analysis can be very, very helpful. If your horses are doing well, there's some very good articles on just kind of evaluating the quality of hay by external factors, by smelling it, by looking at it, what types of things to look for to just get an idea of the quality of your hay. That for a typical healthy horse may very well be enough for you.
Yeah, and the other thing about hay analyses is that when concentrate feeds are formulated, they are formulated to balance out like your averages of these hay analyses. So you can get a good balanced diet when you're feeding a concentrate without even knowing what's in the hay, unless of course, like you said, if there's a specific problem.
So the flip side of that question, I know a lot of our trainers are in boarding situations where they may not have a lot of control over their hay at all. So when we talk about going to forage first to help put weight on a horse, for some people that's kind of beyond their control. So what advice would you give to a horse owner in that situation where they can't really change their forage situation, but they need to get more calories to a horse?
In that situation, you can really look at the feed you choose to go along with the hay, because in formulating feeds, we do formulate to cover the typical nutritional deficiencies in a very wide variety of hay. And it's pretty much an outlier of forage that the feed won't balance. So, but, and you got to look at, yes, you want to have forage first. You don't want if you have very poor quality hay, you're fighting a losing battle. The horses won't eat as much of it. They will get less nutrients absorbed out of that hay. It's not digested as well. And you're actually running a higher risk of things such as impaction colics. So you don't want very poor quality hay. If that is an issue, then if you don't have control over the hay, you might want to go to the barn owner, whoever does have control, and bring these issues. You also can get hay replacements. There's bagged hay, there's cubed pelleted hay, there's chopped hay, there's hay stretcher products. There are all sorts of things that you can feed to supplement the hay and get some basically better quality forage into the horse. And then you can come back as well with a higher calorie feed. As I mentioned before, you've got some of the higher fat feeds. Fat is a really good high density caloric ingredient. So the higher fat feeds, you don't want to go wild on the fat, but 8 to 10% fat in the feed is going to be adding a lot of calories, as well as the higher quality ingredients in the feed. And quite honestly, in general, you get what you pay for. If you want a really cheap all stock type feed, those are often lower calorie, less fortified, and you may have a hard time getting healthy weight gain on that type of feed, but you get one of the premium, high quality, higher calorie feeds that can be very helpful. If you are feeding plenty of calories to that horse and your horse doesn't gain weight, if you haven't already, again, call the veterinarian, because there are so many things that can affect a horse's ability to gain weight, such as gastric ulcers, dental condition, just all sorts of health issues that could be keeping your horse from utilizing their feed and getting all the calories and nutrients. So that, again, that's where your vet comes in to make sure that you've covered all your bases.
So I see that Kathleen's pulled up a slide for NSC, which is can be kind of a hot topic about feeding high NSC versus low NSC. And I think it's thrown around a lot and people might not actually understand what it is or how you can calculate it in a feed.
Okay, yeah, so calculating NSC, I just pulled these numbers right off of those two forage analyses that I had showed previously. So the top one here, the top section is the hay. So NSC is non-structural carbohydrates. And it is the sum of the water-soluble carbohydrates and the starch in the feed. So if you looked at the analysis, you could see on this one, the hay, that the water-soluble carbohydrates were, and this is, so as sampled means as fed, that means including the water, amount of water. And so it was about 10, it was right around 9% in this hay. And then here's the dry matter numbers. That means that this hay without that water included. But if you're looking at hay, if you're calculating water-soluble carbohydrates, NSC, then we usually use the as sampled numbers. So it was 6% for the water-soluble carbohydrates and 0.7 for the starch. So 6 and 0.7 is 6.7. So this hay is particularly low in NSC, non-structural carbohydrates. There is some controversy as to whether to use WSC and ESC. They're both measures of the amount of sugars. The thing is that this water-soluble carbohydrate includes some of the fructan that you find, which is it's a resistant type of starch that doesn't digest in the small intestine. So ESC would be just the simple sugars without the fructans. And you can see there's a little bit of a difference in this hay, 1.1%, which really is not very significant. At KR, we pretty much use water-soluble carbohydrates all the time to calculate NSC. So I was looking at Pasture. Now this Pasture was 23% or 25%, something around there, percent dry matter. So a lot of water. So you can see these numbers. This is the same grass, but with the water is only 4.6% water-soluble carbohydrates and starch 0.4. So we tend to, when we're looking at pasture, fresh grass, we tend to look at the dry matter numbers. So 21.4 for the water-soluble carbohydrates, 1.9 for the starch, and that would give this pasture grass 23.3 NSC, which is a good illustration of how much more sugars you can find in your pasture.
So, and then what do you, like, so we have our NSC computed, and then what do you do with that?
What do you do with it?
Okay, so I guess that would lead into your next question, another question that you would have on whether these horses can do a grain-free diet.
Yeah, that's a very trendy topic right now about feeding horses. So.
Grain-free is kind of a misnomer because, I mean, technically these feeds, they're depending on the calories to come from the high fiber ingredients and then added fat. And the high fiber ingredients, well, one of the mainstays of just about every horse feed is wheat middlings, which is technically a grain. So grain-free is not really the right name. I just call them low starch feeds. It's a little bit more low starch, low NSC feeds. So if you're trying to put your horse on a low NSC, low starch diet, then calculating NSC would be helpful. So you know what the NSC is in your forage, and then you know what you're looking for in your feed. And I think an example of whether it's good for a thoroughbred to be on a low NSC feed was something, a research study that we did at KR that showed that it really depends on the individual. So we had 4 horses on this study, and they were all fed at one time. They were fed either a low starch feed or a high starch feed or a high starch, high fat feed. And then they were fed that for a certain amount of time, and then they switched. And so each horse got each diet at some point. Well, one of the horses there, when he was on the high starch feed and then the high starch, high fat feed, he was an absolute idiot. He was really, nobody liked him. Everybody thought it was like, they couldn't wait for the experiment to be over, so they didn't have to work with this horse anymore. And then it was his turn to be on that low starch feed, and he turned into an angel and an absolute delight. And they're like, oh my goodness. So, but it was that one horse. That's the way the starch affected him. It made him a lot more, gave him a lot more mental energy, and he worried more, and he was just obnoxious. So it can really affect horses differently. And so whether the horse, we've got such beautiful low starch feeds on the market nowadays that are high calorie because they have high fat. So you can get the calories you need into the horse with one of these low starch feeds without having to hype them up with a lot of starch in the diet. Katie, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I do, especially with thoroughbreds. Yeah, there some horses do seem to be affected by, mentally by or I should say activity factor, by the amount of soluble carbs in their diet. But there are a whole lot of horses out there that the soluble carbs in the diet don't have any effect whatsoever on, how easy they are, how active they are, how hyper they are. And quite usually my big concern with sugar and starch, the soluble carbs in the diet, there are horses that are sensitive to soluble carbs for health reasons. You've got various horses that with insulin dysregulation from different reasons, PPID, horses with Cushing's, they may be sensitive to soluble carbs. They may be more prone to laminitis. So horses with a history of laminitis, metabolic syndrome, that type of horse, you really do have to look at the soluble carbs in the diet. But I would say the majority of horses and thoroughbreds especially, if you're really wanting them to work hard, one of the major sources of fuel is the glycogen stored in the muscle fibers. And the glycogen is built from glucose, a simple sugar, and glucose comes from starch and sugars in the diet. And you can get too low in total soluble carbs in the diet, and that can affect the horse's performance. And they may run out of fuel before you want them to.
Yeah, and so that's a good point, Katie, because that research study I was talking about, that was what we found, was that the horses, when they were on the low starch diet, that they did not store muscle glycogen as well. And so they may do well in the beginning, but then they started to get really flat towards the end of the study. So that's when you would definitely want to try adding a little bit of starch in the diet just to help them build up those glycogen stores and give them a little more energy.
Yep. And the dietary starch primarily, there's some starch and sugars in especially fresh, lush pasture grass, but primarily it's going to come from the grains in the feed. So the folks that are looking for the grain-free feeds, which as Kathleen said, that's really hard to make anything into a feed without grain. That may not be what you want for your performance horse. And when you really get into problems with horses and high starch, you're looking at feeds that like have a whole lot of corn, because corn is about 70% total sugar starch. Oats are about 50%, and most of the commercial sweet feeds that so many people are afraid of, they don't have that much molasses in them, so that's not adding that much sugar. And they typically run just 35 to 40% total soluble carbs. So when you add 6 to 8 pounds of that feed along with the hay or other forage, that's not a really high percentage of soluble carbs in the total diet for your horse. And if you're working your horse hard, they probably need that much. So I know a lot of people are just scared of sugar and starch, and they're looking for the grain-free to maybe be safer for their horse. But horses are designed to handle some sugar and starch in their diet. And actually mare's milk can have up to 65% sugar. And boy, those babies do just fine on that. So horses are designed, they can handle some soluble carbs. You don't want to go wild with it, but it's not usually something to be scared and run away from.
So in a similar vein, if you're making changes to a feed program, either to maybe boost a horse's energy or add fat and help it gain weight or take weight away, how long do you give a program before you decide, this isn't working, I need to make an adjustment?
I usually like to go at least give it at least 30 days.
Yeah.
Sometimes calorie wise, you'll probably see some difference possibly in 14 days and 2 weeks, but to really be able to see a difference, I would go at least 30 days and sometimes longer than that.
Yeah, 6 weeks. Yeah.
Because I think, sometimes we're guilty of that, like throw all the spaghetti at the wall method, and just
Yep.
keep making all the changes at once and hope that something sort of sticks. And then at the end, you don't actually know what worked because you changed too many things at a time. So,
very true.
Yeah. So give it time and change things a little bit at a time would be advisable.
Yeah.
And one thing at a time so that you know what's helping.
Yeah.
So this might be a little bit too nuanced of a question, but something Kathleen said a few minutes ago made me think about it. When you walk into the feed store and there's just shelves on shelves on shelves of all the different brand names, how do you know where to start? And is it possible that different brands might interact, or your horse might interact with different brands differently, even with a comparable product?
With if it's truly a comparable product, then there are a lot of good feeds out there.
Yeah.
So rather than it's the plethora of feeds available can just be mind-boggling, because I swear it's getting to the point where if you have a chestnut Appaloosa gelding, you need to go to the feed store and look for the feed designed for the chestnut Appaloosa gelding. But there's just so many. So my recommendation would be to figure out kind of what attributes in the feed you're looking for, and then there's going to be information. You can look on websites for information. You can look on the bag. Usually there's some information about the feed on the bag. The feed tag, of course, is going to at least have the basic nutritional information and a list of ingredients. So again, kind of before you go, think about what it is, do some research and what you're looking for. There are equine nutritionists available, of course, KER, but there are other places you can talk to equine nutritionists and get some ideas on what's going to work for your horse. I'm a member of several Facebook groups, and I would like to caution you. The information as a nutritionist on a Facebook group, I usually just have to say, shut my mouth and let it go, because there's a lot of really scary information you can get from Facebook groups. There's some good information, but you have to kind of sort through. So again, do some research, and your veterinarian is also a resource, and figure out what you're looking for your horse so that you have something in mind before you go in and you're faced with, all those different bags and the pretty pictures and all the marketing information, because every feed out there says it will make your horse run faster, jump higher, and do everything that you possibly could want. And it may not be the appropriate feed for your horse.
Yeah. And the other thing I just want to add is you do get what you pay for. So like if you go in there and there's this low starch feed that is half the price of your regular name brand manufacturer's low starch feed, you have to be a little bit suspicious, because these ingredients do cost money, and there's not a whole lot of profit actually on a bag of horse feed. So there's just no way they could put quality feed ingredients in there for those low prices. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, some of the really high price one, the price may be really high because it's imported. And we make plenty of really decent feeds here in this country. You don't really need to spend extra on an imported feed that really doesn't supply the horse with anything better than what we can do here.
All right. Well, I don't see any new questions coming in from our audience tonight, but if you are watching this on demand later and you do have questions, definitely feel free to reach out both to Kentucky Equine Research and also to the RRP. We can forward your questions on to Doctors Katie and Kathleen. So where else can people go on the KER website to find just some basic information to help them get started?
Equities, the library is I think Katie mentioned it earlier, but it is a huge resource of articles with tons of information about all different aspects of not just nutrition, but there's veterinary aspects and horse management aspects also. So that's the nice thing about the library is you can go in there and you can just search what you're looking for. Let's say
it's got a great search engine. Just put in a word and it'll
give you
a bunch of articles.
Yeah, so that's
yours is one of the first websites I always look at when I have a new question about something. So it's a super resource. So
I want to say too, because of course everybody's going to go to Dr. Google, and I do a lot of Googling too, but you have to be careful because you can find whatever answer you want on Google, but you have to look at the website it's coming from. I tend to gravitate, a lot of the universities have, especially the ones with good extension programs, have a lot of good articles. So if the website is something.edu, it's probably trustworthy.
Definitely.
So you want something with some research behind it that's going to give you good, solid information.
Super. All right. Well, that's good advice for all things on the internet, I think, too. So thank you for the life tips.
Sure.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Kathleen and Katie, for spending some time with us this evening. And yeah, if anybody has any questions, definitely send them in. But yeah, it was nice to see you guys again. And yeah, hopefully everyone's off to a great start with their makeover horses and getting them all fed up the way we need. So thanks very much.
Right.
Have a good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.